Among the forms of folk music, band music is certainly one of the most well-known and appreciated. The ensemble consists of wind instruments, woodwinds, brass, and percussion instruments. Bands have chosen the street as their stage, bringing music up to under the homes and conveying joy and participation. In this section of the museum, you can find parade hats used by various bands, as well as a series of reproductions of the uniforms worn by Puglian bands during the Bourbon reign. These have reached us because the Bourbons required band leaders to deposit uniform designs, which were not supposed to resemble the French uniforms too closely. The corridor dedicated to band music begins with an impressive bass saxophone from the late 19th century, made by Ferdinand Roth, with the mechanism invented by Adolphe Sax. There are two display cases dedicated to brass instruments. The first one contains the brass instruments with a bright and powerful sound, while the second one showcases the singing brass and saxophones. The brass instruments with a bright and powerful sound are characterized by a narrow and long bore. In this section, we find trumpets and trombones. The most unusual one is a natural trumpet in G, entirely made of blown glass, built in Wallonia in the 19th century. Another unique instrument is the Arriva trumpet, with an octagonal bell, outer valve casings, nuts, and rings, an example of how Art Deco influenced the aesthetics of instruments. On the upper shelf, there is a small piccolo trumpet, a narrow and long version for jazz, and other brass instruments with different mechanisms. In the lower section, we find tenor trombones, a serpent trumpet used in theatrical performances, a soprano clavichord, with its characteristic onion-shaped bell, used at Teatro alla Scala during the performance of Wagner's Tannhauser. Another particular instrument is a natural trumpet in the shape of a crescent moon, called the demi-lune trumpet. Facing these instruments, we find a low Rothphone, an instrument with the mechanism of a bass saxophone but played with a double reed similar to that of a bassoon. The other special instrument is a bassoon russe, French, built in Lyon in 1821. It was intended for a Prussian military band and features a fire-breathing dragon-shaped bell to instill fear in opponents. In the second display case, we find the singing brass instruments, the flugelhorns. These instruments have a wider and more conical bore, allowing them to produce a warmer and softer sound. They are the instruments used in southern bands to imitate human voices. On the upper section, there are French horns, flugelhorns, and cornets with unusual mechanisms, such as a keyed flugelhorn built in London in the second decade of the 19th century. There is a strange instrument called a normophone, a trumpet-like instrument with a bell and mouthpiece curved like those of a saxophone. There is also a military signaling horn used during the American Civil War. On the middle shelf, there are numerous flugelhorns with various mechanisms, representing the diversity of construction techniques for these instruments. The lower section is characterized by the presence of some saxophones, a soprano saxophone by Pupo Pupeschi, with the mechanism of Adolphe Sax, and a perspex alto saxophone, the Grafton. This instrument was designed by Ettore Sommaruga in London. He used a mold to pour perspex and create the body and bell, significantly reducing costs. However, this instrument did not achieve great success in England. In the United States, on the other hand, it was used by Charlie Parker for some of his recordings. Among the curiosities, there is a cavalry trombone, an instrument with the lower part of the bore facing downward to avoid hitting the horse's head. On the top of the display case, there are some percussion instruments, including two band drums, one for parades, and tubular bells, which are very high-pitched and used by the Squinzano band. There is a Chinese hat, a shaking idiophone used in front of the band, similar to a majorette's mace. This instrument, built in France, is entirely made of brass and bears the inscription Chevrier on top. Moving on, we come across an imposing straight-bodied B-flat contrabass clarinet. This instrument, now obsolete, is the lowest-pitched member of the clarinet family. In this corridor, there is also a harpsichord dating from the late 18th to early 19th century, with strings plucked by brass plectra similar to those used in the harpsichord. In the last display case, on the upper shelves, we find clarinets of different sizes and mechanisms, including a curved metal one manufactured in the United States. There are 2 terragatos, with the lighter one made of fruitwood designed for left-handed players with inverted fingering, where the right hand plays the upper part and the left hand the lower part. The oldest piece is a French chalumeau from the mid-18th century. Continuing with the clarinet family, we find one made of plexiglass, used by military bands going to Africa to prevent the ebony ones from cracking in the heat. There are also concert oboes, military oboes, an oboe d'amore, a rare metal oboe, and a curved French-English horn from the 18th century, made of maple wood covered in leather, with its characteristic onion-shaped bell. On the lower shelf, there are some extinct instruments, such as 2 double-reed contrabasses used by Puglia bands until the 1960s, played with a double reed similar to that of bassoons. A tritonicon, a very rare instrument considered the precursor to the sarrusophone. An ophicleide, a key bass trombone characterized by its convoluted serpent-like body. Finally, we find bass clarinets and a fully metal contrabass clarinet.